That's scary. New World Pictures.
You find that scary. Well, I guess we'll get into that.
No.
Hi, my name is Perry Martin, and welcome to this audio commentary for Creepshow 2. Joining me is the director of the film, Mike Gornick. Mike, thanks so much for being here today.
You're quite welcome.
Let's start a little bit, why don't we start at the beginning?
This project began, for me certainly, I was waiting in the wings. I had no idea that I'd be offered a feature by Richard Rubenstein and the then Laurel Entertainment. As I believe this was initially earmarked for Tom Savini. And at some point in time, either Tom's availability, whatever, the project came to me. I had just met with some success and notoriety because I had directed a few episodes of the then Tales from the Dark Side television series, and it seemed that one of the episodes in particular that I had directed, called The Circus, which I had the opportunity to work with Bill Hickey, received some notice. And even though my longtime producer, Richard Rubenstein, who was the head of the company, had known me and my abilities, he knew me as a director of photography. And when he saw The Circus, I think he gave some credence to my abilities as a director, and so it came my way. It wasn't an automatic. There was a whole process, as usual, with acceptance by the bonding company, the distribution company, but that was my entry into Creepshow 2.
Now, were you interested in going into directing? Is that a direction you wanted to take your career?
Always. I initially joined the company with George Romero. At that time, it was called The Latent Image. It later became Laurel Tape and Film, and ultimately the public company, Laurel Entertainment. Of course, never imagined, because George was the maestro of the company, I always thought that I would support his activities and was fine with that. At varying points, however, that urge always came forward. Typically on set, while George was busy with other tasks, I would have the opportunity to talk to actors, other technicians, and I realized this could be a joy to actually direct, set the tone, set the mood of an entire motion picture. Not just the visual, but the entire mood. And I had the bug. I knew that's what I wanted to do at some point. And so this was a glorious opportunity.
Did you have your eye on this project then when you heard that it was?
I did not. Many of these stories that, two of the stories in particular that wound up in Creepshow 2, were given consideration in the previous installment of Creepshow 1.
I see.
And were rejected for one reason or another. So I knew of The Hitchhiker. I knew of old Chief Woodenhead. And I was quite excited when I found them in place in Creepshow 2. There were other stories. Initially, Creepshow 2 was to have 5, just like its sister, Creepshow 1, but for one reason or another, budget, etc., it was decided that 3 was a magic number.
I see. Now, George wrote the script for this film. Was there ever any thought of him actually directing it as a follow-up to the first picture?
I don't recall any conversations as such. There were many other projects in the wings that seemed like higher possibilities for George. His interest in the sequel, in particular Creepshow 2, was not his desire at that point. There was a high promise that he might direct Pet Sematary, and I wish he had. I wish he had, and I wish I had shot that. But in any event, I think that was earmarked as a potential George project, Pet Sematary. And this was to be a kind of reward for someone else within the organization. And again, I think it was at that point meant to be Tom Savini.
Interesting. I'm surprised, though, that George wrote the script if he didn't want to be directly involved or too directly involved in the production.
Well, I think just like Creepshow 1, Steve King obviously wrote the original story material, did much of the screenplay, but he and George became very friendly, very simpatico, and much of the polish that was done on the initial screenplay of Creepshow 1 was really George's. So I think just out of a courtesy to Steve, who didn't have time at that point because he was writing it, to do a full-blown screenplay for Creepshow 2, George took that in hand, and at that point they understood each other, they conferred, and I think it was a joint effort.
I see. Let's talk a little bit about these animated sequences. How were these
created?
Are
delightful.
Oh, they're great.
A longtime friend, Pittsburgher friend, Rick Catazone, who, when I first came to Pittsburgh to work in the film industry, worked in the same building, 247 Fort Pitt Boulevard, for a small company called the Animators, and Rick was their chief animator. He worked there with a gentleman named Bob Wolcott, who was the founder of the Animators. In any event, I had become friendly with Rick Catazone over the years when he left to form his own company called Anavision, and I had this project in hand. I approached him about doing the animation. He was born out of the same era as I. We understood the EC comics, and we were most excited about the project. The other little sidelight to his shop was a gentleman named Gary Hartle became a real assist to me because he was an animator in the shop with Rick Catazone. Gary Hartle went on to Hollywood, is working out there now. Aside from doing a lot of the in-betweens and a lot of the inking and a lot of the animation for the wraparounds here on Creepshow 2. He was a godsend for me because he and I collectively did storyboards for Creepshow 2, and they became an inspiration for the cast and crew in terms of laying out my vision.
I see.
And Gary was indispensable.
Well, we'll certainly get into that. For the moment, though, we have a very famous name here on screen, George Kennedy.
George Kennedy. George Kennedy was a delight to work with, and he's one of those professionals that know his craft. I was humbled to find myself actually having offset conversations with him about motivation and the material and his delivery. Here I was, a relatively first-time director, and here's a gentleman who's had vast experience in the industry, and he simply listened, he suggested, and his magic on set was incredible. He was always right on. Minimal amounts of takes needed for his performance, and what can you say? He's one of those consummate pros.
He's one of those actors that always seems to project, joy of his craft. He really seems to be having a good time.
That's true, and it's the same way offset. He's very, very patient. He understands the process, and it was a simple joy to work with.
Now, of course, we have another legendary
Dorothy.
actor, yes.
Dorothy was lovely, and again, another honor. I found myself oftentimes just in awe of the two of them, to find myself in the midst of a set that I was controlling and I was directing. She was a legend, of course, at the time, going back to the Hope films.
Sure.
And again, a delightful person, another pro who understood the process, always very patient, and never deliberated on my confusion, the set confusion, the technician's confusion, always waiting for direction, and then delivered.
How did you end up casting them?
A good friend of mine who worked on the Tales from the Dark Side series had always done the majority of casting for Laurel Entertainment. Leonard Finger out of New York is a marvel at making casting suggestions, and he also has his pulse on availability and so forth. And he and I brainstormed a lot of potential cast suggestions for these roles, in particular in old Chief Woodenhead, and. You brainstorm, you wish, and then Leonard has the dirty work. He goes out and beats the bushes and sees who's available, under what schedule, under what time, under what budget. And but he always moves ahead with the high choices, and he delivered.
I take it with stars of this stature, you didn't read them. They didn't audition.
No, not at all. Yeah. Not at all. There was no need to. I knew George's reign certainly, and had seen enough of Dorothy's work to know that she would be perfect. She would be perfect.
Were you able to have any rehearsal time with them?
We did, for a number of reasons, and luckily so. We had some weather delays in shooting ahead of this particular episode. Appears literally at the start of the film, but we began shooting with another episode called The Raft, and given some incredible weather delays, the schedules overlapped, and I was able to spend time with the two of them. We didn't always have the benefit of set, but we could go through, do script run-throughs and talk about the basic setting and the motivation of the characters, and they were delightful. And they taught me more than I could ever imagine providing them.
I'm sure they appreciated the opportunity to rehearse.
I hope so.
You don't always get that chance.
But they had read. They came prepared, and like so much of directing, you give a kind of guidance and eye, but the actors, the good ones, know where it's at.
Now, where were these exteriors shot?
These were shot all just north of Prescott, Arizona. I think they call it Prescott. And a small little town called Buford. Nearby is the lake region where we shot the Raft. A wonderful setting. As I believe, I think some of these stories were not necessarily intended for the West. There's been much discussion about maybe the setting was really meant to be in Maine, but in any event, I thought this was a perfect setting
certainly
for the Revenge of the Indian.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you have to dress this location at all, or was this?
We found much of what you see, as is, of course, Bruce Miller, who was my set designer and his construction coordinator, did a lot of the polish and the dress. But the physical nature, the store interior in rudimentary form were all there. It was due to his propping and his dressing that it looks so lovely.
Now, you mean this is a location?
This is an actual location.
It
Would have
is.
loved to have made it a studio,
Of course.
a situation, but we really had no studio space. We chose Prescott, Arizona, and Arizona in general because of weather conditions. We had a number of delays getting the film off the ground. Primarily in terms of financial backing. And so when we found ourselves late in the year, we tried to find the most opportune place to shoot the film efficiently and quickly. We decided that given the amount of exterior footage that was needed for the 2 episodes, Raft and Old Chief Woodenhead in particular, that we needed a portion of the country that had fair weather days. And so we localized that through the help of AccuWeather to Arizona, and then based upon scouting, photographs, and some memory on my part, we decided that Prescott was a good base. Unfortunately, with that comes the lack of studio space. So we had to, beat the bushes to find just an appropriate location where we could actually shoot.
Now, did you have to completely dress the set, or was this?
Oh, absolutely. What you see there is basically we moved into a derelict store area. And all this propping down to the open-end wrenches you see in the background, the crescent wrenches, the pencils on the table, are done by Bruce and his staff.
That's wonderful. I mean, it really looks authentic.
Yeah.
Wait, Benjamin. Wait.
Despite the advice and the recommendation of AccuWeather, of course, we had some dreadful weather.
Is that right?
Yeah, there was a hurricane in the Baja. We wound up losing nearly 8 days to rain in Arizona. As luck would have it, because we had to schedule actors being 3 stories, we had to take a gamble and move ahead with the Raft, which, because of its total exterior nature, we, in losing those 8 days, we fell incredibly behind schedule. So at this point, we were very stressful. By the time we shot Old Chief Woodenhead, we were already some 10 days behind schedule.
Oof. So you had to move fast.
We had to move fast, and during the majority of these scenes, I'm somewhere at the call of cut offset with the bonding company.
Is that right?
Who's urging me to speed up, and do you really have to go on to Maine after you finish here in Arizona?
Afternoon.
Tell me a little bit.
To which I said, if you put that gun away, we'll talk about it.
It got that bad, huh?
It got that bad. And listen, it's a responsibility of the director and the producer to respect the monies of those who have invested. And I understood why the bonding company was there.
Sure.
They were never strong arming me, but they certainly wanted to see the schedule progress as rapidly as possible.
Did you have to compress this a little bit in order to make the schedule, or did you get what you needed?
I thought moving into this entire shoot, I was incredibly prepared. I had all my shot lists prepared. I had blocking diagrams prepared. So I knew at this point that I could be as efficient as possible. My one pain is that I couldn't be as self-indulgent in some cases in terms of additional takes, additional coverage. I had to quickly reduce the scope of my coverage and get through it.
Well, it's a very precisely shot and edited film, particularly for a first-time director. So I'm assuming that a lot of that comes from the fact that you did prepare and that you storyboarded extensively.
I did, and my training ground was not so much in working with George because we had a much looser format and approach to filmmaking, probably ultimately far more enjoyable. My real training came during the making of Tales from the Dark Side, the series, where I learned the absolute need for efficiency of shot list and preparation, because we would shoot those typically, which were half-hour episodes, in 3.5, 4 days maximum. And all studio bound, and so one had to be prepared. One couldn't waste time. Very limited numbers of feet of film to shoot. So it was a great training round. And so when I moved into this, I was already prepped to prepare well.
Well, that kind of schedule certainly keeps you focused, I would imagine.
Right, exactly. I want to make mention of Frank Salceda, who plays Ben Whitemoon in this episode. One of those joys to work with. Brought a lot of credibility, authenticity to this whole segment. He changed some of the language. Some of the scripting was not authentic Apache, and so he gave me some suggestions, and he was a real help to this story.
How did you find him?
That was in a casting session in Los Angeles. At some point after the principals were identified in terms of a star cast, Leonard and I went out to Los Angeles and spent some 3 days casting all the additional roles, and Frank was one of those who came to the casting session, and he. I knew he was immediately right for the role, and had actual Native American integrity.
Wow, that must have been an advantage.
Absolutely.
Now tell me a little bit about these other three actors, these young actors that are in this sequence.
Well, Holt McClanahy and David Holbrook, Don Harvey, who played the thugs, the ruffians in this scene, were also part of that casting session that I mentioned that we had in Los Angeles. And Holt, in particular, brought an intensity and a dimension to that role that I spotted immediately during the casting session. We looked at a number of people for Holt. We at one point tried to maybe plug some star value into that role also, but I knew Holt, given his abilities, and particularly during the readings in the casting session, would be absolutely perfect for this. They were all quite good. They had a kind of spontaneity and understanding of the script that when they came to read for me, I knew they would be absolutely right. And there is a kind of magic when you're doing these sessions that, and it's not so much merely that they are prepared, they have a sensitivity to the material. And aside from the readings that they did for me, I like to talk about the script, and they seem to understand their role and the ultimate morality of what was needed in this scene in terms of their sin and the retribution that had to come forward.
Well, the actors seem to really be having fun playing these parts. I mean, they're really sinking their teeth into these roles, and you know.
I hope so. Again, this is one of those episodes where we had some time to prepare. Again, because of the overlap and the delays in finishing the Raft, I was able to work pretty heavily with most of the individuals in old Chief Woodenhead, and so we came prepared. And thanks to them, we actually improved the schedule by 2 days. What formerly was to take about 8 to 10, we finished in an absolute 8, and so we were saving time. And it's much to their credit because they were prepared and they were sensitive and gave me their all.
Now, there's something disturbing about seeing these two old, lovable veteran actors being abused by these three young hoods, you know?
Yeah, and we understood that, and I think that's not necessarily a casting accident. We knew that if we took somebody who already arrived with a kind of appreciation by the audience and a sensitivity that there'd be a built-in appeal and a built-in kind of mourning for their demise.
Well, it's a real shorthand, you know. They're bringing with them all this history that they have in all these movies that we've seen them in, and then here come these three characters and, you know, abuse them, and there's something really disturbing about that.
Which all worked to my advantage, obviously.
There's 100 million women out there just waiting to run that hair between their legs.
Let's talk a little bit about your DPs on this shoot. Now, you're coming from a background as a DP yourself. And you have two credited on this picture.
I do, and before we get into some of the subtleties of changes in my crew at this point, Tom Hurwitz, who I had met in New York, worked with in New York, was my initial choice as DP on this film, and saw me through most of the Raft. the dilemma, the turmoil, the chaos that occurred because of the delays and rain, the finger pointing begins, and much of what happened in terms of a change in crew, be it my first AD or my director of photography, was because of that dilemma of losing time.
I see.
And I tried to accept as much of the responsibility as I could, but obviously it was weather related. And
Right.
Unfortunately, when you're in that hotbed of criticism in terms of can we make up time, we're shooting too slowly, now that we're back on set, can we do any better? People get stressed. And at one point, we had to replace Tom with Richard Hart, who was delightful. And he brought along with him a second camera person, Henry Link, who was delightful and could do a lot of finish up on the Raft with the second unit while we were finishing here in Old Chief Woodenhead. So getting back to the changes, unfortunately some of that came just through the stresses of production and the finger pointing, not from my standpoint, but from producers who were looking to speed up the process
Right.
and finding fault and never pointing to God and say, why did you bring rain?
Right, right. Well, certainly you would think in a location like Arizona, you would think you could depend upon lots of bright sunshine and clear weather.
Oh, and that was the absolute prediction of AccuWeather. And, I have testimony in terms of written documentation from them saying that at best there's a 5% chance. No one can predict the hurricanes and the problems in the Baja that forced a weather front up on our heads.
And one more step and blam!
Now, this is a very stylish movie, but there are less visual references to comic books than there were in the first film. Why did you choose that approach?
I didn't necessarily choose it. Much of, if you remember Creepshow 1, in terms of the backgrounds, which I innovated with George in terms of strengthening points of high emotion and high script points, I simply couldn't afford. I didn't have studio space. Much of that, and certainly no optical budget. So much of that is dependent upon a very controlled studio situation, and having none of that, nor the luxury of time and money, I had to forego that and try to find the next possible best link to the EC Comics, which was a fuller animation. I think I have fuller animation in and around the stories than in Creepshow 1. To that, I also wanted to add at one point some live action to precede the animation, which amounted to Bill Gaines actually appearing before the Senate subcommittee when the code was adopted in 1954, which I thought would be very interesting as another layer of wraparound, which would lead into the animation, which would lead into our stories, but provide for today's audiences and the audiences of the 80s and the 90s the real substance of what had happened to us in terms of the EC Comics and the censor code that was developed.
That's very interesting. Now, Bill Gaines, we should say, was the publisher of EC Comics.
That's correct. That's correct.
And you wanted to bookend the film with,
I actually wanted him to both precede and to follow the stories, and use the stories going into animation or out of animation, and then back to the Senate subcommittee to make some points.
That's very interesting.
And we also had Dr. Wortham, who was there, who was speaking on behalf of censorship and the changes in the comic book. And I thought it would just bring home some substance in terms of what is Creepshow. It was born of what? But that was dismissed very, very early in terms of a suggestion. And
it's an interesting idea. It would have been very interesting.
Yeah. But I think much of the confusion when I read some of the criticism or about Creepshow 2 in particular, and somewhat of Creepshow 1, is that there's a lost understanding of the idiom of comics at the time and what they were trying to do or trying to escape. And it was the kind of McCarthyism of comic book publication that they were trying to get out of and really couldn't, because there was a public outcry against violence and zombies and vampires,
right,
and gratuitous sex, so-called. And that would have been important to reinforce.
Now, George is famous for being a fan of EC Comics and always cites that as one of the big influences of his formative years. you were familiar with those comics as well?
Somewhat after the fact. As was Stephen King, by the way. They both shared that experience. I was born a little later, and so these were comics that I could investigate because of older friends who happened to have the EC comics. By the time I was of a reading age, my only availability was to the Archies and the Disney comics and so forth. But I knew this wonderful material existed.
Right.
And if I visited my friend Albert George, he had a few of these under his bed. And so
now they're worth thousands.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. The man behind Old Chief Woodenhead is a mime from Pittsburgh, Dan Kamen, who I think did an incredible job doing many of these scenes. He had to sustain absolute stillness, and of course at some point he had to represent a kind of wooden attack when he comes to life. He was wonderful to work with. Again, an old-time Pittsburgher who came out to Arizona to work with us.
Tell me about the costume, how that was created, and what it's made of.
It looks very, very rigid, but it's actually a pre-foamed plastic, in essence, done as a full cast on Dan's body with life mask and crafted by Ed French out of New York. But it's truly relatively resilient and more of a latex compound. Some of the specific scenes, like the one we're watching right now, where we observe cracks and movement and so forth, they actually went to a costumed layered suit just to provide a little more flexibility. But in essence, it's all seen from the rear. It was an incredible effort in terms of molding and construction and sculpting by Ed French.
Now, did you have one suit, or were there multiple
There
suits?
were multiple suits. We had we could afford two suits, obviously, if we incurred any damage. Many of these are also sectioned, as you can imagine. Also, it took an incredible amount of time to touch up the suits on a day-to-day basis, from take to take, and so much of the time lost in some of these scenes was to that repair work.
I see.
And sheer exhaustion. The suits became very hot, and we'd have to break just for Dan's sake, so that he could get out of the costume, just to get some relief. And then back into the costume, and then it was the whole prep again in terms of the seams and the care of detail on the suit.
How about it, bad stuff?
Now, how are these shots?
These were
taken?
these driving scenes, as all the driving scenes were done with tow cars, camera car, shooting from the rear, actually shot on location.
So you didn't do any process work?
No, had really had no budget. We had only one significant process shot, and that's the final shot at the end of the Raft, where we did some enhancement.
Well, I
of the
actually
Blob.
think this is always preferable. It's better to see the real thing than to see something that you've,
I was born of that, but I've over the years developed an appreciation for CG and digital touch-up, and it can be glorious too. And obviously, in many cases, particularly in the Raft, not so much in this sequence, had I had the ability of digital compositing, I could have saved even more time, gotten out of things. But we lived in a physical age back then, and you performed and accomplished the effects on set.
I see. Now tell me a little bit about this location as well.
Again, this was basically a location that was an existing trailer that we utilized. Again, we didn't have any benefit of studio and so forth. And this was just a derelict trailer, again, that Bruce and his boys did an incredible propping job.
Well, you can't. This can't possibly be the interior of a trailer.
Well,
I mean, you must have
a double wide,
really,
that we utilized. Yeah, and it's all due to the good graces and abilities of Bruce Miller.
That makes for some very tight shooting spaces, though.
Yes, it does.
Boy. Now here we have the first of a couple references in the film to the Cisco Kid.
Right, one of my all-time favorites.
Is that why it's there?
That's why
I was
there.
curious. But not just in this episode, then there's the reference to it in the Raft as well.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct, yeah. It was also, aside from being my all-time favorite, is one of those old series that had just the right price, and they said, well, Mike, if you want to be self-indulgent and put one of your favorites on, find us something cheap, But I love the Cisco Kid.
Oh, it was great. And this is all down in Arizona.
Absolutely, yeah.
Even this interior here
This is an actual home interior. Yeah. No studio space available, so we had to. As much of George's early photography, also, he always shot on location. If memory serves me correct, I don't believe it was until Creepshow, actually, that he had the benefit of what amounted to a studio, which was actually a conversion of an old boys' school gymnasium, Strand Still building, that we actually converted to a studio.
I see.
He loved the inspiration and somewhat the environment of an actual location, so we often did this. You know.
Did you feel that your experience working with him served you well on the shoot then?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He remains the maestro, and even though he couldn't work with me directly on this particular shoot, I wish he had. He was always there, and when I got into a bind or a situation, the words of George or the examples of George came to mind, and he sustained me.
Now here's a particularly EC moment.
Yes, absolutely perfect one. And back to the Cisco Kid.
Now the first film, if I'm not mistaken, was distributed by Warner Brothers.
That's correct.
And this is New World. Why was this a New World project, and why didn't Warner Brothers want to do Creepshow 2?
I believe that Warner Brothers did not find Creepshow 1 to be a financial success, a distribution boffo, and so they had little to no interest. They had some story rights interests in Tube, and there was some buyout from their rights to a Creepshow 2 and some of the stories, but I think they didn't have the faith in a distribution of Creepshow 2.
Now, of course, here we have like a Dutch angle that's very reminiscent of what you might have seen in an AC comic.
Yes, exactly. Which is much of the style that I had adopted by working with George. I think his Dutches and his angles, his extremes of height and low angle, he attributes to being born out of EC.
I take it this is obviously a set. You built this somewhere.
Yes. We actually that one had to be because of the breakaway wall. I think it might have been the back of the storefront that we used. We found some likely space to use.
But you took advantage of it to get those high angles as well.
Yes, exactly. Also very EC. Those incredible points of geography have always been an inspiration to me in terms of simplifying for the audience. Let's take this look, almost like a floor plot, or ingenious, And the storybook artists always look to give you that because they had a single cell to work with it. How can I define this quickly, And they took that kind of architectural approach in terms of a view,
Well, they're very cinematic comic books, and you look at them and you really feel like you're looking at a little movie in print form.
Exactly right. There's my beauty, the 1950 Pontiac.
Tell me about that.
I fell in love with this. This is actually owned by an elderly lady out in Prescott, Arizona, and we approached her about using it. And at one point, she was either at set or I think we were actually returning the car, and I told her how much I loved it, and she said, "Do you want it?" And I said, "I do, but I don't know how I could transport it back to Pennsylvania." I thought about going back and seeing if she's still there. I was always fascinated by the old Pontiacs had the chieftain hood ornament that actually lighted,
Right. This is nicely lit.
Yes. It's also a very sensitive scene.
Well, he plays this really well.
If you notice, our Woodenhead, I don't think is necessarily of the cigar store variety. I mean, I always looked upon the statue of the Indian here as being almost like a Catholic piece of statuary where you owe respect, where you imagine that it might come to life. It represents more than just something in terms of a crafted stone figure, that there is a kind of spirit behind it. And I think that last scene with Frank and old Chief Woodenhead hopefully portrays that. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more about the animated sequences here now, Mike. How involved were you in in the design and the creation of these?
Luckily, in the early phases, because at that point in time, I was not a full-time New Yorker in terms of professionally reporting to the office. We still had, at that point, the remnants of the old latent image, Laurel tape and film, later to become Laurel Entertainment office in Pittsburgh. And while George had left the full-time employ of Laurel Entertainment, we still maintained a Pittsburgh studio. And I was both the sound mixer and editor at that facility. And so at that point, I was able to meet often with Rick Catazone and his staff, both at the Pittsburgh office and also at Rick's studio out in Castle Shannon. And so we had the ability to satisfy some of my storyboards, which I mentioned, working with Gary Hartle. I could spend a lot of time sketching and preparing the animation scenes. So that was of a real benefit. The animation scenes, by the way, came about because initially the early script forms actually called for a la Creepshow 1 live-action wraparound. Despite my desires to do the Bill Gaines wraparounds, there were to be live-action wraparounds which would lead directly into the stories. And when at varying points there was a look to reduce the budget, I said, hey, I can better enhance, because I don't have the benefit of backgrounds and optical effects within the stories. If I'm allowed to do more animation, I can better bring home the reality of the EC by doing animation.
I see.
And they bought that concept, and Rick Catazone saved my budget because he did all of this animation for about $25,000.
Wow. That's amazing. You know, I always thought that the EC comics would make a great, feature animated film. It's really a shame that people think of animated films in terms of children, but you could, you could really bring those to life in a marvelous way if it, in fully animated film.
Yeah, and I think it is now entirely possible. One needn't rely on the old cell animation. Given the digital age, one can compose far more quickly, and I think that day is coming. I'm sure it'll dawn on someone. Yeah.
Now, we're into the Raft.
We're into the Raft, right?
And again, we're still in Arizona. Now, how are you getting these shots here?
These are being tracked, some by the forward tow car, some by camera mounts, both on the hood, on the side. This took some of those traveling shots took quite an amount of time because the roads weren't particularly friendly out there in Arizona.
I'll bet.
So we encountered a lot of shock problems for the camera, but a lot more fun, a lot more energy to shoot them that way than as a process shot.
What are the challenges as a director, though, because you can't be behind the camera when the actors are working? How do you...
We had video assist. So I could, even though it was interrupted quite often, as it always is, by either shock or vibration, but I could line up a shot and look at it. I could always listen because we had radio mics.
I see.
So I could gauge performance, and we also had video assist where possible. I could watch some of the principal action, but it is difficult. Yeah, there's nothing like being on set. Yeah.
I think this is a real nice group of young actors. I'm assuming these all came from your Los Angeles sessions.
Absolutely, well. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful cast and very right for this kind of story.
Perfect.
Yeah. This is a beautiful location. I was very, very fortunate. Many of the early storyboards in forcing my imagination on what the location should look like. Later on, when we did our scout and moved to Arizona, it all came to life when I found some of these locations. This was a state preserve, relatively isolated lake with lots of dramatic angles. This side looks very western Pennsylvania. The other side looks very much like the Rocky Mountains. I mean, it was a beautiful vista. The unforeseen here was that this lake, while it looks gorgeous, is incredibly cold. Evidently, there's an underground spring that feeds this lake. We had no idea until we got deep into shooting there on a regular basis.
So they're not acting here. It's
no,
cold.
It's very, very cold. There was also some algae growth or whatever that caused rashes, and it's one of those horrors with shooting in water, or with children, or with animals.
Right.
That you'll learn the hard way. But we needed it for the story.
What were some of the things that you had to do with the crew in order to get those shots? I mean, when you're in the water, I'm assuming people are in wetsuits and things like that.
Some of them were at this point. my DP Tom Hurwitz was not always in a wetsuit, depending on the angle and the need. Oftentimes, we had an auxiliary raft that we shot from that we could also utilize.
I see.
And a side mount from that to get some of these shots. But my acting crew were marvelous. They put up with the punishment and the cold. Danny Beer in particular, at one point, actually suffered hypothermia from doing a swim back
Really?
to shore, and we lost him for 2 days. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, boy.
Yeah.
Now, this was the first sequence that you shot?
This was the first sequence, and again, we did that because lack of studio space meant that we had much to prepare in terms of the sets based upon actual locations, a kind of a late go-ahead in general from our money people, and because this, in essence, existed, we could move into it quickly, although the hidden needs, even of this particular kind of a shoot, is that the construction of the raft that they use as a prop, our needs as a shooting crew,
Right.
shooting from another kind of raft to offer some sort of camera stability, the divers that are needed here just to pull along our blob through the water.
Did you have a name for this character?
We call it the Blob.
The Blob.
Yeah.
Not very creative, but it certainly it says it like it is. Now, you wouldn't guess that there's a storm brewing in this location.
Well, this fortunately were the early days. We had maybe 2.5 good days where we got a lot of this photography out of the way, the road shots. I believe some of these scenes here are our very first day of shooting. And so it seemed like, yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
What beautiful weather.
Right.
Get me AccuWeather on the phone. I want to thank them. And then overnight, these storms would move in. It was incredible, incredible. So luckily, we got some of these early scenes out of the way and the road shots, and then the rains hit.
In total, not counting the break, how many days do you think you spent on this location?
On this particular location, we probably spent 24 days. 24 days.
You were there quite a while.
Yes. And then some, because I had mentioned that Henry Link came in as a second unit and did some blob shots like this one, and here in particular, for us as cutaway material and so forth. It probably expanded to more like 28 days total. He did some other kind of special effects work for us.
Okay, why don't we talk a little bit about the Blob itself? What is it and who made it?
The Blob, the Slick, was a marvelous invention of our mechanical engineer, construction coordinator, Ed Fountain, who had worked with us over the years in Pittsburgh, a graduate of Carnegie Mellon. It was his design. There were actually 4 to 5 different configurations of our Blob, depending on the scale of the shot and the size needed. They range from a 10-foot version up to a 40-foot version.
Really?
In particular, Ed's design had to incorporate the ability to be to have the Blob towed, to be manipulated underground or underwater by divers. It had to have a surface that could have an application of appliances. A lot of the particular interest you see on there from moment to moment is work contributed by Ed French or Howard Berger and his crew, which are applications on top of the latex sheath and so forth.
I see.
But the sheer manipulation of it all was all Ed Fountain's genius, and he was just that. And there's a final scene where the Blob actually makes a movement, a leap, and that is again the engineering skills of Ed Fountain.
Oh, that's done all in camera then.
Yes. Oh, yes.
That's right. I just can't get worried about it.
So this was a latex sheath that was then covered with various textures and
exactly. He applied some basic texturing. The sheer molding of this was an incredible task. We rented at a studio space near Camera Mart in New York on the Upper West Side, and he had a large space in which to texture and lay out and dry and create this blob. But it was still ultimately combined with a layer of nylon and mechanical devices that would allow it to both float and be manipulated.
How are these tentacles created? What was involved with that?
That's actually a pretty simple gag. The actual movement of the material itself was done by reverse photography. So we're actually creating some of that with what they call ultra slime that initiates the moment, and then with an optical reverse creates the illusion that it's actually climbing. In addition to some appliance work that creates the body of the blob attack.
Who was on your makeup crew involved in that?
Ed French again began as the chief makeup artist due to the shift change in crews at one point.
Right.
We moved to a person within his staff, Howard Berger, who became elected as the new makeup chieftain. Greg Nicotero, Mike Turcic. There was some wonderful Evan Burrell. There were some wonderful makeup artists that stepped in after Ed was forced to leave.
And some people that you worked with before. Greg was on Day of the Dead.
Exactly. So it all felt very friendly.
I see. I think these young actors are wonderful. Did you have an opportunity to rehearse with them at all?
Yes. Are you kidding? With the rain delays we had,
Yeah, plenty of too much opportunity.
Yeah, we had a lot of opportunity. We had a lot of frustration to get on with it, which can be counter to your efforts.
Yeah.
And once you get out there, there's always an impatience, not necessarily on my part, but on their part, because they feel they are sensitive to what has happened, and
that kind of a delay can really be an energy drain. I would
exactly.
imagine.
Yeah, it works both ways. Energy delay, and also it wants them to perform adequately so we can move on. They realize the pressures of the director and the production, but they were wonderful. They're very, very patient. And like I say, this scene in particular, these scenes in particular, are all very physical in nature. The temperature looks wonderful here. It's not necessarily, it's an upper mountain region, so it's really more like in the mid 60s. And once one is doused with water or whatever, there's quite a chill.
Yes.
But they were wonderful. They were real troopers.
The raft, is it under us?
Yeah. And I'm gonna swim for it right now.
No! Don't leave us here, don't!
I'm fast and I can make it. Gotta go while it's underneath the raft.
Mike, were there any actors that you would like to cast in this film that were not available or you were unable to get for certain reasons?
Oh, absolutely. We have not seen that episode yet, but in The Hitchhiker, although I benefited greatly from the entry of Lois Chiles into the role of Annie in that particular episode, Barbara Eden was actually my first choice.
Oh, really?
And she actually arrived in Maine. We went through a costume fitting and so forth, prepared to shoot the next day with Barbara, and she received some tragic news back from L.A. that her mother was ill.
Oh.
So she was forced to leave the shoot. So another loss in time. We lost, almost 4 or 5 days until we recast. Lois is one we had looked at earlier, was unavailable. Barbara was another one of my choices. We got Barbara, and so luckily Lois's schedule opened up, and actually because we had so many delays, her schedule had finished, and so we were able to use her in the role.
She came in and pitched in for
Yes, right. So that's the only sacrifice I made, in essence, and hardly one. Still worked out very well.
Oh, Lois is great at this. Now, did you have any trouble? It looks like you have a storm brewing there with the clouds in the background.
Exactly, yeah. There's some telltale signs here and there.
That was actually a question that was on the tip of my tongue. You know, there's so much. This whole thing is an exterior. You must have had some continuity issues on a day-to-day basis with the weather.
You always do. I mean, in a perfect world, you can look at this in dailies form and then reshoot and so forth. But obviously, on this kind of a budget and with the stresses of this kind of schedule and falling behind schedule, you have to buy a lot of this. And you can see we're tightening up as much as possible here to reduce the telltale signs of the background in the sky. You try to lift contrast because, you had sunny weather and you had high contrast, and suddenly you're losing that. The light's getting even. So you try your tricks the best you can to get around it, This is one of those scenes that is typically called day for night. And depending on how the print is timed and how it is transferred, you lose some of the glory of what you put into a film negative or in the optical process. But this still looks relatively day for night. The basic trick is you look for a high contrast day so that you simulate moonlight versus sunlight, and you try to cool off the scenes as much as possible, pulling out the warmth so it has an appearance of night.
Now, is that something that you do with filters shooting, or is that something that's
We
done-
elected not to. I decided to put it most into the processing in post
I see.
and the printing, because we didn't want to necessarily lose any depth of field by adding too many filters.
At least you have a clean image to work with. At that
Exactly,
point.
exactly right. This point here, you're looking at probably the 30 to 40 foot blob, and again, all its animated characteristics are done by underwater towing and manipulation with ropes and with levered handles and so forth. I had a wonderful diving crew here. Tassos Demarcus is one of the divers. In fact, one of our safety men on this shoot, along with some local divers. Incredible for them also, even with wetsuits. Some of these waters were incredibly cold. So as you can imagine, the whole line of communication from surface to underwater in terms of cueing and action calls got quite hairy sometime.
Well, I imagine it was the most technically complex of the 3 episodes to shoot.
It absolutely was, and then, of course, compound that with all the delays and some of the lack of preparation. Again, one of those victims of schedule and so forth was Joe Winogradov, who was my first AD, my first elected choice, was also replaced at some point. And he had spotted a lot of the deficiencies in terms of preparation, technically, for this kind of a shoot.
That must be hard on the morale, though, of a crew when you're going through changes like that.
Especially for the director, you develop a kind of relationship and shorthand with people who have gone through the whole pre-production process with you and understand you, have sat through your storyboards, your shot selection, your scheming, your plots for all these scenes of blob movement and so forth, and then they're gone.
Right.
And it shakes a director's confidence in a way, to have to pick up with relatively new people, even though they might be within the crew. It's like rebuilding a relationship.
Well, especially for a first-time director, I would imagine,
Exactly.
Now, here we have a scene that I think dramatizes the triumph of healthy teenage libido over fear. I mean, it just shows that no matter what the situation, teenagers will be teenagers.
Exactly. What else is there? And why hasn't this dawned on him earlier?
I don't know. It was his first opportunity, I guess. Again, it looks like you've got a lot of diffused light back there.
It was also the perfect situation. This is shot as early morning. It's actually a magic hour, late day, but yeah. It's
so you can sell it as early
one of
morning.
those. Yeah, it's one of those magical scenes.
Yeah, she's a very beautiful
so beautiful.
girl.
Yes.
I guess you can't blame the guy for taking advantage.
No, exactly. I actually had to reach. This, oddly enough, is shot on a very overcast, rainy day. We did add some filtration here to do some matching. It's actually pouring out there. Hard to believe, but
really?
It is. We went to a longer lens to compress the background so you wouldn't feel the rains. But this is one of those days where we said we've just got to shoot something. We've got to get something shot, even though it's raining. So we tented, and through the use of lighting and the protection of a tent, we shot these scenes. Yeah.
Wow. That must have been a challenge. Did you anticipate that coming? I mean, did you have all the equipment that you needed in order to...
We pieced together as quickly as possible what we could, and it's to the credit of my crew, of course.
Boy, dealing with those kind of challenges really separates the men from the boys making a movie. You really just have to get it done.
Luckily, most of my technical crew remained the same. An old friend, Nick Mastandria, was my key grip, and he was quite handy at adapting quickly and put a lot of this together very, very, very quickly. Again, with the assistance of Ed Fountain.
shocking effect. Now, is this shot on the water as well?
No, this actually was shot on land. And it
So
was-
when you could, you'd get on land.
You'd have to, yeah, you'd have to, just for the imbalance of shooting on water and the inability to quickly retrieve supplies and so forth. We moved to stability where we could, you know.
Would you be on the the beach there, or would you?
We
just
were on the
go-
beach, yeah. Again, we had no formal location in terms of a studio space.
Now, this is the sequence where the actor eventually got hypothermia.
That's exactly right. That's the scene. And here comes our friend.
Did you experience any technical difficulties with this shot? I mean, this is a complicated little moment that we've got coming up. Was this hard to achieve, or did you get it?
The whole sequence was very, very difficult to achieve. And in particular, most of this blob movement, just getting it up to speed, getting it to maneuver without folding over on itself and so
Right.
forth, took a number of takes.
Probably a lot of things you wouldn't imagine until you get on location and start doing it.
Exactly right. You know, unless you had moved off a previous shoot where you had used some of these materials and gone through some of these situations,
You just don't know.
You almost have to. That's an incredible shot.
That's amazing.
How
was that done?
As I can best describe it, Ed had a number of cantilevered hydraulic arms on another device that he built that literally emerged out of the water and moved this sheath, the blob sheath, up and out of the water on top of Danny.
That sounds very complicated,
Yeah.
especially for a modestly budgeted film.
Well, he was an ingenious guy. He had no budget either, but left to his own devices, he pulled it off. It's one of my favorite shots here. Just move around. I can see my location. It's a sunny day. And it feels very EC to me.
It's very EC, this last shot. They all end that way, though.
Yeah, if
All
only I
these
had the
episodes.
creep. And of course there's no swimming.
No. Too late.
Well, swimmers, that was, slick,
Now, Mike, were you involved in directing the voice actors on
Oh,
the
absolutely.
sequence?
Yeah, those
Tell
were
me.
all done in New York. And I had the benefit of Joe Silver, who has left us, has moved on, but a wonderful voice, commercial voice. He is the voice of the creep.
I see.
Again, through Leonard Finger, we did a full casting session for all the youthful voices. And that was done after I came off the shoot, the Arizona/Maine shoot, and had some time to properly prepare and audition, and they were a lot of fun. Yeah.
Typically, the voice actors are recorded before the animation is done. Is that the way this was done?
I gave Rick Catazone some voice reference, which were my voice, and I could do a creep.
Right.
I could do that. Welcome to another exciting episode of Creep Show.
That's excellent. You could have done the voice yourself.
Well, I did later. We anticipated a TV series called Creep Show, which I wish we had gotten off the ground. Couldn't sell for some odd reason. And at that point, Joe had passed on. And so in the editorial phase, I actually did the voice of the creep. A lot of fun. Anyhow, I provided Rick Catazone with a lot of voice references, and he was able to utilize those. And then, obviously, after we had assigned and made our choices for voice talent, we went back to the Sync Sound Studios and did a post-up session against the animation.
concoction, our last morbid masterpiece, which I call...
And now we're into The Hitchhiker.
And we've moved on to Maine. Another incredible point in our shoot, because we had finally finished in Arizona. Initially, I had anticipated they would be leaving Arizona at some time in October, pre-winter, pre-Maine winter. Unfortunately, with all the delays, we were nearly already into November and pushing our luck. But this is one we owed Steve King. God bless him. The stories are wonderful, and this whole project, both 1 and 2, are because of he. And we wanted to shoot one episode in Maine, and so this pushed us off in making a massive move, as you can imagine, crew and all the way from Arizona to Bangor, Maine, via Boston, and again, another loss in time schedule. Compound that with the loss of Barbara Eden. We were behind the 8 ball once again, and winter approaching. None of the winter in The Hitchhiker was written into the story, and it was an adaptation once we got on set and once we faced...
Did you experience additional delays as a result of the weather in Maine?
We couldn't at that point. I had to make do, and I used the snow as a transition at one point.
So if you'd had a blizzard out there, you would have been out there filming.
Well, we had blizzards, and we just kept filming. We had road stunts on icy, blacktop highways that became doubly dangerous. But we just forged ahead. We had no choice. We couldn't go past Thanksgiving.
Well, on the other side, though, I mean, it really adds a wonderful quality to the
I think
to
so.
the film.
I think so. And sometimes the whole energy of adapting, which is what I kind of grew out of with George in terms of the early films, where you take on the environment, you take on what possibilities you have, and you make it work, and you don't give it too much thought or angst, and you just you move ahead. Sometimes that energy works in a very positive sense. Yeah.
I was going to ask you what the total schedule on this picture was, but I don't think you probably could even
Well,
guess.
it was meant to be 48 days total. Unfortunately, I'm sure we took probably the better part of 60, given all the delays and additional travel days and underestimated travel.
What was your initial budget on this?
It was always just under $4 million. And that was the published... I have a copy, and you think the director would get the full budget, but he didn't. I got a front page, and it's 3999999.
Really? Was there some particular significance to coming in under 4?
I suppose it probably would have been a deal breaker if it was 4 or above, and
Now, how were? What can you tell me about New World and the people that you had to deal with?
Almost invisible. Most of my conversations were through my producer David Ball. In terms of Mike, they think you're going to be all right for this. There was the whole selling of the process. Of course, Steve is no kind of a sell job, nor was George. Stories by Steve adapted by George for the screen.
Right.
I was somewhat problematic. Oh yeah, he's the guy that shot, but he can shoot. But can he? What's he all about? Again, I had done some episodes of Tales from the Dark Side, which they watched. I think they were still hesitant. Gee, I wonder what Savini's doing. That took some time, but eventually they came around, and I did become the director. But that was all commentary that was given to me by David Ball, Richard Rubenstein. They like you, but they're thinking, and very little direct contact. Later, after we finished. I talked to the art department that prepared the poster work and some of the other ancillary art materials and so forth, but very little direct contact. Most of my contact came with the bonding company itself, the insurance company. Pre-shoot, we had some meetings with film finances. They obviously came out to set, and later on when I finished at Pinewood Studios in England, all the sound finishing and final mix were done in Pinewood.
I didn't know that.
Yes.
Really? Why over there?
Again, savings. I'm not sure that was true, but David Ball, who was an Englishman, convinced the executive producer, Richard Rubenstein, that there was an incredible savings. Peter Weatherly, who was my editor, who had worked on Runaway Train, has a long list of credits, a wonderful British editor. Obviously, could work out of England. There was a savings there. He could go home every day.
I see.
Jimmy Shields, who was a marvelous sound editor, could also work at home. And I was the only variable. We'll fly Mike in. We'll look at some stuff. David Ball lived in England. They all lived nearby. So that became another kind of cost savings. We looked at the trials and the expenses of what we had gone through in terms of the shooting schedule and the production itself, and now we could save money by going to England. And I suppose we did.
Well, it's certainly a pleasant enough studio to work at.
It is.
Let's talk a little bit about David Ball. What did he do for you on this shoot?
He was very, very supportive. I had first met him actually on Creepshow 1. At that point in time, he was an auditor for United Film, and was keeping tabs on the day-to-day budget. He and I later went on a scouting mission of Maine for Pet Sematary, what was to be the George Romero project next. And that obviously preceded Creepshow 2. So we became close, very, very friendly. And he eventually became my producer for Creepshow 2. Always very supportive. A very difficult task because I think much of what we had to do was even novel for David Ball. He was not necessarily a producer by trade. He came out of bookkeeping and auditing and so forth. So this was his break also. And some of the stresses and the demands of this particular shoot, I think, proved to be a lot for David also, in terms of all the travel and the locations and the problems of schedule and the rain delays. So, in essence, both he and I were experiencing a lot of this. He brought to this film, though, some marvelous things through his associations with Rick Wakeman and Les Reed. He brought some wonderful music to my attention. And I think those are high contributions. He also was the key in terms of moving to Pinewood eventually and doing the finishing there. He actually had offices at Pinewood.
We shouldn't let this appearance pass.
Who is that
without
guy?
mention.
Is that Steve King? No, wait a minute.
It could be.
Steve was very, very gracious. Like I say, he was very busy at work at this point and chose to give us one entire evening while we shot this scene, this little roadside scene. This is where...
Who made the request? I mean, did you specifically want him to be in the
yes,
picture?
Absolutely, yeah.
And he had been in the first film.
Yes, he was. He was Geordie Verrill in the first film.
And he seems to enjoy playing very eccentric characters.
Well, I think it's born out of the fact that he's amongst very eccentric characters up in Maine. I think it's an endless source for his material, and he likes those folks, as well he should. And he's the most unpretentious, great man I've ever met.
Tell me about working with him as an actor. What was he like? I mean, what did he?
He's very, very raw, and I knew, luckily, having worked with him on Creepshow 1, and I think he's free to admit it, that he has no inherent ability to be an actor, and he needs a lot of information. He needs a lot of feedback, and he wants to know, did that work? Did it not work? What else can I do? And his scenes take a little longer to pull off because he doesn't have any kind of innate ability, but he tries real hard, and I think
well, he could have very easily walked through
that's
that.
Pretty much Steve. I think Steve's oftentimes dresses just like that damn truck driver there, and I think as long as you relate to him, that just come on as you are, you did just fine, and he did. He was marvelous.
Did he have any involvement with this project other than furnishing the original stories and this appearance?
No, he really couldn't. I wish he could have had more opportunity, but he's virtually a factory, a producer of material, and he had his own needs. I got to see him and stop in and talk to him about shooting once we got to Maine, but his time is limited, And he was most gracious to give us this little cameo, obviously.
How would you describe him as a person? I mean, what's your
A
experience?
lovely man. I think if he didn't have all the pretense of the fact that he's a great author and a wealthy man, and you'd have no way of knowing. You met him in a diner, you'd swear he was a truck driver for Humpty Dumpty chips. He doesn't flaunt any of that whatsoever. Very, very unpretentious.
Now, Mike, do you? I understand that that you did storyboard this picture. How much coverage do you like to get beyond what's in your boards?
Oh, much, much more. But it's always a good jump-off point. The vision as you sit down and you read and you digest a script. You have a personal vision. You must be able to see the scenes, otherwise, how do you ultimately convey them, or how do you set up your shots? So I use those as high points to show everyone else, because everyone has a vision, obviously, and down to the prop person, certainly to the composer of music, to set the editor's mind. You need these key frames to show them. But beyond that, it's pretty obvious. You need to do all the in-betweens, and I like as much coverage as possible. And something else George taught me over the years is that the benefit, once you're off the shoot, unless you have that B-roll material, those additional angles, that additional piece of coverage, that cutaway, you're lost. Mm-hmm. It's a salvation sometime in the editorial process. Mm-hmm. And many would say that's overshooting, that's self-indulgent or whatever, but...
well, I don't think you had much time on the shoot to be self-indulgent, did you?
No, but you could grab quite often, the additional shot during a setup even, if you found the right moment, the right kind of insert, if you could stay attuned with your DP, And the difficulty here is that it was so damn cold and so adverse that we didn't have a lot of time for those additional items, and so we had to get to the bare bones essential. And setting up that shot we just saw, where you might want to shoot the on ramp and you might want to get a quick insert of the wrong way sign just to add as a little bit of extra punch. You didn't have time because you're on such a restricted schedule and you had to move on.
Lois gives a real committed performance in this movie. What was she like to work with?
She was wonderful. We had a lot of time because of the stunt setups for the automobile in this particular episode. Tom Wright, who plays the hitchhiker, is also a wonderful stunt man. He had a lot of makeup applications, so we had a lot of good trailer time to get prepared for these scenes. And she claimed that the adversity of the weather and the conditions and so forth really helped her.
Really?
Really, yeah. Her whole method became stronger because...
So as an actress, she worked with it.
Exactly, and that's probably very true. I can understand that, that there was this physical adversity going on at the same time she was confronting this horror.
Now this looks like it's shot night for night.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
How do you do that?
Well,
especially with a long shot like that.
We pulled a lot of lighting in from Boston, knowing that we wanted to keep this as dense and as night as possible. And it was, again, to David Ball's credit, he was able to find some money so we could pull some high-powered equipment in to pull off some of this lighting. Obviously, in some of these forest scenes, we had no other choice, and Dave and I would have, I think in most cases, given the overcast nature of Maine at that time of the year, it would have fallen very, very flat. So we stuck by our guns and kept this night for night.
But good heavens, all the generators, all the extra crew.
Absolutely.
And
it was enormous. Now, much of what you see here in terms of the movement, those branches flying by the car that brush by Tom Wright on the tight shots, or even some of the windshield shots, are actually done in a garage. And we're actually physically moving branches past the car and so forth, and simulating shake of the car. These little scenes here are probably over no more than 100 yards of distance outside of Bangor. And so the terrain you keep diverse, but it's limited in terms of by shifting angles you can give it a new dimension, a new look, but you're really staying within a very localized area.
I think this sequence looks great. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I love this whole sequence. It's my absolute favorite, and I gather from reading all the reviews, this is the one that everyone loves.
Yeah. But it must have been terribly complicated because not only are you shooting at night, but it's all action.
It's all action, and this is one that had to be not only storyboard but prescribed in a very exacting fashion of shot selection and setup. And luckily, I'd done that homework, and was also familiar with this particular portion of the wooded area because we had looked at some of this for Pet Cemetery, so I knew some of the likely logging trails that lead through this area for coverage of supplies and delivery and so forth. And so there was a benefit in having been there before, that I could logistically know the lay of the land.
How many cars did you have to go through?
We destroyed almost every car. We went through 4 cars. The hero car, as we like to call it, which is Lois's car, was on loan from a very friendly dentist, and we annihilated the poor guy's
He was
car.
friendly before the shoot, right?
He was very nice about it afterwards, too. I had a great guy, Henry Nevison out of Maine, who was a professor at the University of Maine, Orono. Later went on to form kind of a pseudo-film commission there, was of assistance to us, and he was the one who actually acquired the Mercedes for us, because it was a match to some of our autos that we actually imported in from England. Again, a supposed cost savings, but we got 2 to 3 in from England and parts. We found a matching Mercedes here in Maine through the help of Henry Nevison. But his damage came on those evenings where we were doing towing with Lois in the hero car, and given the icy conditions,
Right.
we had a couple mishaps. So we returned a slightly damaged Mercedes.
Slightly. You have a gift for understatement, I'm sure.
I must tell the poor doctor, none of the scenes through the forest these were our import cars, but I'm talking about the straight riding shots.
I see.
Yeah.
This is a great makeup on this guy.
It sure is.
Whose work is this?
That's solely Howard Berger and the boys. That eventually became K and a B Effects out of Los Angeles. Yeah. A good group.
Greg is also...
Yes, he's involved in this heavily. I mean, I must tell you, at some point late in the shoot in Maine, those poor guys weren't getting paid anymore, but they stuck with me and gave me support and said, we're going to finish this thing.
Well, that must mean a lot.
Yeah. I'm forever in their debt. But I was so impressed with Lois. She always sustained. She never lost her understanding of point in time. And her madness here at times is so convincing. You know, she was a joy.
Well, she's really playing it for all it's worth. I mean, that's one of the nice things about actually all the actors in this film is they're really pulling out the stops. They're in sync with the material. You know,
Exactly.
they understand that it's over the top a little bit. And,
Exactly. As it must be, right?
Yeah.
As it must be.
Now, this looks like it's a process shot.
This is not a process.
It's
shot.
not.
Well, luckily Tom is a stunt person, and we're actually...
Maybe
we're
I just
tooling.
think it looks like a process
Well,
shot
good.
because I can't imagine it being done any other way.
And such a trooper he is. I mean, as you can imagine, traveling at those speeds. This is not...
Well, that's somebody's there banging on
I mean,
the
it
cart.
wasn't Lois driving. I mean,
Oh, okay.
at some point we had to provide for her safety.
Right.
This is my one shot in the film, director of photography here. My camera angle.
How many takes typically do you like to do, Mike? And what would you think you would have done on this shoot?
Impossible to determine. I mean, obviously, when you're doing stunt work of this sort, you like to get it once for obvious reasons because of all the inherent problems with the props and the safety of people. And so you set up multiple angles to cover that. In terms of pure performance pieces, I guess I'm about a half dozen kind of guy. It's hard to say. I mean, sometimes you lock it on the first one, and for some damn reason you want to just get a safety, or you want to see if you can push the envelope even further, you know. A lot depends on your actors and how well prepared they are, but I would never live with one take. And once you get to two, you think, well, you know, let's go ahead and push that envelope and go for three, even though those two are in the pocket, you know. And here comes our snows.
So you had real snow.
Yeah, this is real snow.
Wow. Well, it works great for the shot. It looks like maybe that was something you incorporated to
Yeah, no,
take
it
advantage
was,
of the
it was a
moment.
lovely payoff, and it wasn't anticipated, so we wound up using it as kind of a point of transition, and it works. It's obviously she'd been out for some time.
Oh, it just
The
adds
snow.
it just adds a little bit to that moment.
And it was lovely. Yeah, it was lovely, but difficult to work in.
I'm sure. It must have been very cold.
That and added to the forest terrain, the loose leaves and so forth, you know, add the element of snow. And so, again, bringing in the generators and the lighting and the foods and the coffees. And, you know, it's treacherous.
I'm sure you just encounter all kinds of little technical issues that you don't anticipate, just like with the raft. You know, when you're out there doing this kind of action, there must be a million little things that go wrong or ways that you have to
Oh, absolutely. I
improvise.
mean, Lois is being a trooper right here because basically, you know, the car is so derelict and so damaged at this point, the heater's not working properly, so we can try to blanket her in between takes or get her swiftly off to the trailer if the trailer's nearby. But, you know, she's enduring a lot of this herself.
Hit a tree, that's all.
Which would you say was the most difficult of the 3 episodes to shoot?
Without a doubt, the Raft. For some reason, despite all the adversities of weather and the physical nature of the stunts and so forth in the Hitchhiker, there was something you could, in a positive sense, just simply attack, and you realized the problems you were going to encounter. The Raft took us so much by surprise. We knew the dangers of working on water, but it was just some of the unforeseen that you innocently think the swims in the water and the movement through water, and you don't anticipate what we encountered. And the weather was just debilitating. You just couldn't have imagined. You were so disappointed that you had come this distance to find some sort of cover in the sunny clime of Arizona, only to be dashed, by rains.
I guess an experience like that teaches you not to be an optimist on a shoot, but to plan for the worst.
Exactly. We truly had not much of a choice. I mean, given the whole scheduling issues, because these are 3 distinct stories, you obviously don't have a pool of actors available to you. So it's not like you could move on to old Chief Woodenhead because look at this damnable weather, we'll go shoot. Because of scheduling and the cost of bringing in actors and supporting them, you had to stay to a strict schedule. We're going to spend X number of days on the Raft, and then we're going to bring Dorothy and George in. If you were closer to L.A., you probably could have made some of those changes. But when we found ourselves in Arizona, there's no way we could support bringing in actors ahead of time and run to that interior cover, which was the store, and get those shots out of the way.
Would you say that doing a anthology film like this is, more difficult than in a technical sense than?
Oh,
than
absolutely.
Doing,
and from a directorial standpoint, the relationships and the understanding that you develop with your actors is far better if you can sustain over a 90-minute, 100-page script a kind of continuity. But when you're doing these little short items, you're constantly confronted by a new situation, and you've got to build again and hopefully have the time. Now, again, the weather in terms of Arizona helped me in many ways get prepped with my actors for these scenes. But you can imagine if things are going along smoothly, you get one crew out and a new crew comes in, and there's not much rehearsal time, and he's about had it there.
Yes.
But it never ends.
Yeah, it's disgusting. But great. Did you test this film before an audience?
We did not.
Really?
We did not.
Just
I
went out
don't
for the
recall
test?
any test audience. If New World did something on their own, they never informed me. Never gave me any results, any research.
Did you yourself go out and view it with an audience ever?
I didn't have time. We were so close to the release date, and given my background, aside from pre-production and directing and then finishing at Pinewood, Laurel Entertainment, which was my company at the time, I was on the staff there, put me to work in terms of the total finishing. And okay, Mike, now you go out to L.A. and let's time the answer print. And I was always utilized that way. I never had an opportunity to take a video cassette and show some of the friends and get some reactions, or even ship a copy off to George. I assume Richard did that at some point, but I just had day-to-day tasks.
Did you feel that was a disadvantage? Would you have liked to have screened it? Or
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And it's something that's kind of unsatisfied in my mind that I never had a sit down with George and or Steve and learn from the experience, nothing else. Get their input and say, Mike, you killed me here. I have a perfect script element and you blew it. I heard a lot of that from my producer, Richard Rubenstein, but I wanted to go to the creators, of the material, and never had that opportunity, unfortunately.
Looking at the picture now, which of the 3 episodes do you think is the most successful? Which one do you
Without
like?
a doubt, The Hitchhiker. Yeah, without a doubt. And as credible as all the stories are, I think that's the strongest story. The strongest story.
Now, there's a little in joke right there that we went by.
Yep.
Gornick Realty.
That's right.
For people that wish to freeze frame the image and check that for themselves. How did the movie perform when it was released?
Very well in the first weekend. critical acclaim was very, very weak. And I remember getting all those press clippings following the opening weekend and getting disappointed.
You read that stuff.
And disappointed.
Yeah.
But you learn that, you make Mike Gornick an abstraction, and you say, gee, he received some bad criticism. In your mind, you did the very best you could, and you can't explain all those circumstances. You can't call the critics and say, had you been with me in Arizona,
right.
you could have seen what I went through. It doesn't matter.
Right.
They're watching and that's their absolute right. They're either entertained or not, or I like this story, or a lot of the criticism was the stories are weak to begin with, and some of that may have been true, but I have to blame myself as a director for not bringing more to them. But in any event, we had those reviews, but it had a very good first weekend, and it held. I think I don't know if New World didn't have the prowess or didn't have enough dates. I think it could have sustained itself for a while. It certainly returned their money. But if as any distribution outfit has the right to assume that it's going to go through the roof, and they wanted to. These are oil wells we're digging here,
Right.
And you want a high yield. It wasn't the high yield for them. But nor was Creepshow 1. I think Warner's never had anticipated, never received the kind of return they expected.
Now, I don't know if we've mentioned it or not, but Tom Savini plays the creep in...
He does, and what a credible role it is. He was wonderful. And, prior to this film, I mentioned to you that I think Tom was initially earmarked to direct this, but he and I always had a kind of pact, and this is born out of Dawn of the Dead. Tom, when you direct, I'm going to shoot. And Tom, when I direct, you're going to be the special effect artist. And unfortunately, he wasn't available. I turned to Ed French, who I'd worked with on The Circus, which is the Tales from the Dark Side episode in New York. But I desperately wanted Tom to be my effects director on this. But as fate had it, I couldn't. And likewise, later on, when he was shooting the remake of Living Dead, I wasn't available, and I was under contract to Laurel. But he did... accept the role of the creep, and I think he's absolutely perfect.
Now, this is the end of your first film as a director. Looking back on it, what do you think of the picture, and what was the experience like for you looking back on it?
It was wonderful. I must say that I was just simply swept along, though. I had no time to prep myself for it. That day, which came via telephone from Richard, who said, "Would you like to direct Creepshow 2?" What could I say except yes? Wish I had an agent at the time. Like, look at the material,
right,
and say, Mike has some suggestions here. He'd like a fourth story, a fifth story, but I was so accepting of the whole role and so enthused that you just get swept along, and before you know it, you have a producer, and maybe you're not necessarily fully simpatico with him in terms of creative notions, and you don't anticipate, some of the criticism and the reserve that the distribution company has about you and the product.
But if you thought about that, you might not begin it in the first place.
Well, exactly. But, given savvy, I think on your next film, that's what you should have. So you say, well, I did that one. And I think it shows I'm credible. I can pull this off. I took the material, be it what it may, and got it done, and we didn't cream the budget. It's somewhat entertaining, So I'm satisfied in that regard. But I wish I had the wisdom moving into it.
What do you think you learned the most then directing this picture?
Well, as I've learned throughout my entire film history, is that if it ain't on the page, it ain't on the stage. And not being a writer per se, I'm not a writer-director, but I can identify material. I would like that kind of strength to say, this material is not right for me, or this material needs improvement. And that's no criticism of George or Steve. It's just that if I am to do this, I need that kind of input, and I didn't. And but I'm a hired gun. I was working for the company at that point, Laurel Entertainment, and it was their material, and I took it and ran with it.
We should comment on this end.
Yes, this was a lovely little editorial piece provided by Collier's Magazine back during that whole event of the early 50s where comic books were going under scrutiny. And this was a little response by Collier's which said, look, parents, you have the ultimate responsibility. It's not radio, it's not motion pictures, it's not television, it's not comic books. It's you.
Well, that's as true today as it was back then.
Absolutely.
Mike, this has really been a pleasure. Thank you.
I enjoyed myself. Come again.